What's up, everyone? I'm Jason Fitzgerald from Strength Running, and you're watching episode 11 of Q&A with Coach. Today we're going to talk all about ultramarathon training and trail races. And as you can see, I'm not alone. I'm joined by my good friend Matt Frazier. Matt, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. So, in case you don't know Matt is an ultramarathoner himself. You've run 5 more?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe 6 or 7.
You've lost count.
I've lost count.
Including a 100-mile ultramarathon, and he's also the founder of NoMeatAthlete.com, the author of the book with the same name, so we're really excited to hear your perspectives today. All right, let's get into the show. All right, our first question is from Jackson. Jackson wants to know, I'm shifting from a road marathon to a long trail race of about 50 kilometers. What should change about my training besides the terrain? And this is a good question because a lot of people do transition from the marathon to the 50K, and they're not entirely sure how they should adjust their training because a lot of people just simply do some longer long runs and they do pretty much the same training as they would for a marathon, but there are some nuances between training for a 50K versus a marathon. And I've actually never run a 50K yet, although I will be doing one real soon. So I want you to start off and kind of talk about maybe something that you've done that worked really well in your transition from the road marathon to a 50K.
Sure. So I think the most obvious thing that I learned was that although it's just 5 miles longer than a marathon, you're out there, because it's also on trails, you end up being out there for something like 40 to 50% longer than it takes you to run a marathon at top speed, depending, of course, on what kind of trails you're on and things like that, because there's a lot of variability there. So it's not so much about learning to run that distance as much as learning to be on your feet for a much, much longer time. And all that comes with that, which includes learning to fuel yourself for a much longer time. Because for some people, marathon fueling strategy is going to work just fine to continue that through a 50K. But for me personally, like a marathon, by the time I hit mile 22 or something, I can't do any more sugar. I'm just done with gels and sports drinks and things. So I had to kind of rethink that whole thing and figure out what worked for me. And that meant, more whole foods, some fruit and things like that, and even some starchy or carbohydrate bagel type things, just to keep you going. Maybe add some fat in there. So that's the big thing. Mostly what you can do is experiment. Just use your long runs as time to experiment with fueling strategies that you can sustain for a much, much longer time. And the second big thing is the mindset is different. So you've got to realize that if you're going to be out there for 50% longer than it takes you to run a marathon, that it's quite likely that you're going to need to. You don't rush through the aid stations in the same way that you do. I mean, unless you're trying to win your 50K, which maybe you are. But ultras, in my experience and at my level, have been much more about finishing versus not finishing. That's the goal. The goal is to finish the race, particularly in your first one. And that means taking your time through aid stations, making sure you get exactly what you need. You switch your shoes if you need to, because there's a lot of mud and things like that. Walking up hills is a really good strategy to do for your first ultra. Like from the beginning of the race, just walk, no matter how minor the uphill grade seems to be from the beginning, it doesn't hurt to walk up that hill. One of the surest signs of a trail beginner, particularly in an ultra, is the guy or the girl who's passing everyone on the uphills, and then later in the race, everyone's passing that person because they just blew out everything on the hills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Jackson mentioned the terrain should change, and that's definitely true. And I want to differentiate a little bit on here about the terrain. So terrain is not just the surface that you're running, it's also the elevation changes that you're running. And so Jackson is running a trail 50K, and depending on where you are, what type of race you're running, that might be an extremely hilly trail 50K. And so, yes, you definitely want to get on the trails to do some of your long runs because that's going to be very specific to the race that you're preparing for. you also want to make sure that you're mimicking the elevation changes that you're going to experience during the race itself. So you're going to want to do this during training, during your long runs. So you want to practice what you're going to experience on race day during training. That's ultimately what training for any race is like. You want to experience what the race is going to be like during training. The other thing that I'll say too is, there's a couple classic ultramarathon training strategies that you're probably going to want to use that you wouldn't use when you prepare for a marathon, but you do want to use when you prepare for a 50K or even a longer race. And those are what I would call an over-distance long run. So when you're prepping for a marathon, most runners are never going to run longer than 20, maybe 22 miles. But if you're prepping for a 50K, you probably want to be out there for longer than 22 miles, maybe 24, 25. Personally, I think you want to cap it around 25 miles. And you go any longer than that, and the recovery needs for something like that is just huge. And you don't really, there's a point of diminishing returns. And then the other training strategy is back-to-back long runs. And so, if you're training for 50K and you're doing a 20-mile long run 1 week, maybe a week later or 2 weeks later, you might want to do an 18-mile run on, say, a Saturday, and then a 16 or 15-mile run the next day. And so teaching your body to run long on tired legs is going to mimic what it's like on race day, and I think that's super valuable.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say about what about the training strategy actually changes. Really, like, the rest of your training strategy doesn't have to change much. A lot of people would argue that there's less of a need for speed work in ultra distances. Some would say that there is, particularly at the top levels. But I think you can shift some focus away from those faster workouts towards putting that energy into longer workouts on the weekends. That's really the big difference. Is get a few more miles into that longest long run and use the back-to-back strategy. That's another great way to get the mileage in without totally trashing yourself and having trouble. Because it's not that practical to go do a 25-mile long run. You take a lot of yourself. It's hard. You don't have aid stations and stuff like that. So it's easier to break it up sometimes. But I do think one time get up near the marathon distance for your long run if you can.
Yeah, definitely. So Jackson, great question. Thanks for submitting it. And let's go on to question number 2. Okay, question 2 is from Jay, and he or she wants to know, I'm training for a 30K trail race, which is 18.6 miles, if my mental math is correct. Where do I put hill work into a training plan? Do I swap it out with speed work? This is great. So this isn't necessarily this isn't an ultramarathon, of course, between 18 and 19 miles, but because it's a trail race, it may actually take you almost as long to complete this run than it would a road marathon, depending on the technicality of the trail, the elevation changes and descents and all those things. So I would definitely, kind of train like you would for a marathon for something like this. Of course, totally depends on the race itself. Without knowing if it, maybe it has 6,000 feet of elevation gain, or maybe it has 100 feet of elevation gain. That's going to change, your approach to how you train for a race like this. But, in terms of hill work, there's, especially with trail races where there's less of an emphasis on speed because the terrain does slow you down. You don't necessarily have to do, the hill repetition type of workouts where you're doing a minute or 2 minutes up a steep hill, like at a really hard effort, you're jogging down as recovery. That definitely, I think, has a place, but it probably has a place as what I would call a sharpening workout close to the race. So you would want to do this maybe 4 to 6 weeks out from your race, but no further out, because then you run into the issue of kind of peaking too early and kind of burning yourself out from doing too much intensity too soon. So, I think the other valuable types of hill work that I would think about are just practicing climbing and descending during your training. This is kind of what I would call a roller coaster run, where you go out for, let's say, a 10-mile run, and you're just in a hilly area, and you're kind of going up, you're going down, you're running the terrain, you're just kind of adapting to it, and you're getting your legs ready to constantly be going up and be going down. I think it's also very valuable to do something like that at the end of your long runs. So it's going to mimic what you're going to feel like maybe in the last 4 to 8 miles of a 30K trail race, which is you're probably going to be running some hilly terrain on some really tired legs. So by doing this kind of roller coaster effort, maybe on the second half of your long run, you're mimicking what you're going to feel like during the race, and that's a really great way to do it. What do you think? Do you have any
Yeah, I was
thoughts
going to
on
do
that?
something similar. Like, I mean, what I've personally done is never really done dedicated hill workouts for ultras. You just make hill running your regular running. You just start running on terrain like what your race is going to be on. So like with a road marathon, a lot of times when I've trained to get as fast as I could on that, I would seek out the flattest possible places for my long runs and things like that. Just because I wanted to hit certain paces, and it felt like if I were on hilly terrain, then that stuff would be thrown off, and I couldn't train as meticulously. Know that I'm hitting these specific paces. With ultra training or trail training in particular, I mean, maybe your goals are still going to be the same, like a road run where you're trying to finish as fast as you can. But if they're not, if it's more about complete this race and do it pretty well, I think you can just shift into do your runs on hills, and you're still going to have different. You might still do a speed workout that's kind of just on a little bit hillier terrain, but that's the thing I would do. Just kind of get used to, instead of running on flat, running on rolling hills most of the time, and on the terrain that's like what you're going to be racing on. I think that's probably the best thing you can do.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing that I'll mention too is you want to be really aware of your effort when you're doing these kinds of hilly runs. So it's not a structured workout. So I always call them a roller coaster run. Matt simply said, do hill training all the time. You're just always running hilly terrain. But what you want to make sure is make sure that your effort is roughly the same on the uphills and the downhills. So you don't necessarily, especially for a 30K, which it's not an ultra, you probably maybe you're doing some walking in a 30K, maybe you're not, but you don't necessarily want to be walking all of the uphills. You want to make sure that your effort on an uphill is the same as your effort on a flat section of terrain. And so what does that mean? That means you're probably going to slow down by a good margin depending on the length of the hill, the grade of the hill. So these are really important things to keep in mind, because if you're trying to maintain a particular pace on an uphill, then if you're early in a run, you're going to be really hurting later in the run. If you're trying to run 9-minute pace and then you hit a steep hill for half a mile, 9-minute pace, if that's your easy pace, is going to feel really hard on a steep uphill, especially if it's a more technical trail that you might be on. So just keep that in mind. You can speed up a little bit on the downhills, but of course you don't want to hammer those. You don't want to go too fast, because you're just going to incur a lot of muscle damage and set yourself up for some very unhappy quads later in the race.
Hills are speed work in disguise, right?
Hills are speed work in disguise.
So there you go. Maybe you don't need the speed work.
Who said that? Frank Shorter?
Some famous runner.
I think it was Frank Shorter.
Oh.
All right. Those are our 2 trail/ultra questions for today. Big thanks to Jackson and Jay for submitting them. If you want your question on the show, you can just tweet it to me at JasonFitz1 on Twitter. Just make sure you use the hashtag #RunQuestion, or if you're not on Twitter, you can always just email it to me, support@strengthrunning.com, and I hope to see you on our next show. Thank you.